Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Program Officer in the Hagley Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. During these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great research being done out of the collections in the Hagley Library, especially work being done by folks who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships from the Hagley Center. One such scholar is joining me today. Matthew O'Neill is a PhD candidate at the University of Georgia, and we'll be discussing his dissertation project titled Home and Hell in Appalachia, the Great Migration and the Making of Sundown Towns in the Mountain South. Matt, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks. Good to be here, Greg. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Well, let's talk about your project. What is it that you're researching and writing about?
Yeah, so it's essentially a social history of the Great Migration in Appalachia. And I'm focusing mainly on the first phase of the Great Migration, which starts during World War I and continues a bit afterwards, with a focus on how some of these communities that experience waves of the Great Migration choose to reject those migrants and become what are called Sundown Towns, which are essentially places where only white people can live and work. And I'm comparing those places with other communities that are very much connected within, in my case, the coal economy, other communities that looked much more diverse and sort of fostered just a more diverse racial and ethnic population. So that's kind of the elevator speech.
Yeah. Well, could you perhaps unpack this phrase, sundown town?
Yeah.
Sounds like it's an artifact of racial segregation, but what else does it mean?
Right. So the scholar that wrote the book on sundown towns, he actually just passed away, James Loewen, who was a sociologist. He defines it as a place that is all white on purpose. And most of these places were outside of the South, especially outside of the Deep South. I mean, if you just think about the demographic makeup of the South, it would be hard to have a sundown town in a place like Black Belt, Alabama, or the Delta in Mississippi, just because there are so many African Americans that live there. But he traces it, I think he sees the origins of it really when any kind of worker comes in that does not look like the people that already live there. So he sees this phenomenon happening in California in the 1880s with Chinese immigrants that come to take jobs on the railroad. And those are some of the first examples of communities pushing out those undesired workers. But again, most of the time you'll see these in places outside of the traditional South, or in my case, Kentucky is very much a border state. It's right on the line between Midwest and South. It's in some ways sort of the gateway to the South, but also to the industrial Midwest and also to the Northeast. So any place where the population looks sort of all one way and experiences a wave of migration, you could see this happen. And sort of my task is to figure out why it happens in some places and not in others. And so I look at, what are the work that these people are doing? How is that shaping how they view other workers, other racialized workers? How are they viewing those? How are they organizing their communities? What social groups are they involved in? All of these things, I think, kind of contribute to their worldview and how they would view other people that come in to sometimes take their jobs or work alongside them. It could kind of depend on the scenario, but that's sort of the task that I undertake.
Well, I think that presents it neatly in a nutshell, but before we move on, what specifically is the significance of the word or the phrase sundown town? Is it meant to be taken literally?
Yeah, so the sort of the use of the phrase sundown town, it's all sort of word of mouth, and rumor would sort of spread the word about these places. And the phrase that would be uttered to someone passing through town. I mean, I know a man personally who grew up in Lynch, Kentucky, which is one of the towns that I look at, which was a U.S. Steel Company town. And they were passing through Corbin on the way to someplace else and stopped for gas. And the gas attendant told them to be out of town before the sun went down. So the insinuation is you can pass through, you could do a little bit of business in these places, but you probably don't work there, and you certainly don't live there. People could work, in the case of Corbin, one of the towns that I focus on, there were Black employees of some of the hotels in town, porters and things like that, but they made their homes elsewhere in sort of surrounding communities. And in some cases, there are rumors of signs also being posted sort of at the edge of these communities that say, racial slur, comma, don't let the sun set on you. So again, just that understanding that you'll keep moving on and will not make your home in that place.
The implicit threat being your personal safety will be threatened.
Exactly.
Should you choose to linger.
Yes. Yes.
And also, perhaps while we're sort of defining terms, what, for those who might be unfamiliar, what is the Great Migration?
Yeah. So the Great Migration is a period that sees the U.S. undergo a dramatic sort of demographic shift. I don't have the exact numbers, but I think if you look in 1910, about the population of African Americans in the U.S., over 90% live in the traditional Deep South states. So South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, sort of that, the old plantation South, really. But by 1970, that number is more like 50-50. And so this process starts again with World War I. And, you think about, we often think, I think more so this happening with World War II, but soldiers go overseas, those jobs become available. And for the first time, essentially employers start looking for new sources of labor. And one of those places is the Deep South. So there are labor agents that go all through places like Alabama and promise Black workers higher wages, better lives away from the more like rigid Jim Crow system. And so you see that process start to happen in World War I, and it happens again in World War II. So people are moving from, again, places in the Deep South to Detroit, to Chicago, to Pittsburgh, to New York, anywhere that there are an abundance of jobs available that they can take, but also to places that you wouldn't expect, like in Appalachia. And it's all sort of tied together to this industrial economy that's very much spurred on by the war effort. So anywhere there are jobs available, people are moving to, and that makes the country look a lot different when it's all said and done.
And so how then do these processes intersect in your study area in Kentucky?
Yeah, so the two communities that I'm really interested in comparing, one is Corbin, Kentucky, which was a very important railroad hub for the Louisville-Nashville Railroad, which was really where all the coal from places like Harlan County, which folks might be familiar with, where there's a ton of coal production. All of it had to first be shipped to Corbin before it could go to other gateways. So Cincinnati, a lot of the coal was going to South Chicago, where International Harvester and later U.S. Steel has these giant steel production plants. And so I'm comparing the railroad hub with a place called Lynch, Kentucky, which was a U.S. Steel Company town. And it was built in 1917 by U.S. Steel because they knew that there was a tremendous amount of coal and stuff that was really good for coking coal, just very high quality. So they made the purchase in 1917, built up a company town that at one point was the biggest and most state-of-the-art company town in the world. It was home to over 10,000 people of various races, ethnicities, all of that. And again, it's this process that links them, and it's World War I that kind of jumpstarts the process and causes U.S. Steel to look for a new source of fuel, which creates the company town, but it also has ramifications for Corbin because you must expand the rail yard to accommodate all of this new output of coal, and that sees all these new jobs created in the construction industry, which again, brings workers up. They interact with white railroad workers. And in the case of Corbin, a conflict ensues and they're pushed out and it becomes a sundown town. So really, it's that same process sort of affecting both places, but one ends up looking very different than the other.
And when you dig in on the social history,
Yeah.
what explanations do you find that help, that you might argue, help to shape those different outcomes?
Yeah, well, as I sort of hinted at earlier, I think it has a lot to do with people's everyday lives, really. The kind of work that you do, who you interact with at work, the kind of unions you join. A lot of the railroad unions were lily white and excluded African Americans, especially like the railroad brotherhoods. So engineers, firemen, conductors, trainmen, sort of the more specialized unions were more exclusionary, which I think sort of shaped how they viewed African Americans, as opposed to, you know, the United Mine Workers Union, which organized Black, white, Southern and Eastern Europeans all in the same locals. And so the work you do matters, the kind of unions you join matter, but also the employer as well. Employers could sort of exacerbate or attempt to exacerbate those racial tensions that they knew existed through things like wage differentials, you know, or just simply importing strikebreakers that were of a certain race or nationality. So all those things I think matter, which I think is a easier way to sort of understand that. I think sometimes we think of racial conflict as sort of maybe not inevitable, but just as like a bug in the system, but nothing is inevitable. There are reasons why things happen, and they happen in very specific contexts, and it's all very localized, at least in the stuff that I study. So I try to drill down to the very basic sort of everyday experience and connect that to larger ideas about what do people think about race at this time, especially in the context of the Great Migration, which is very new and very drastic, and in the context of the war as well, and especially that Red Summer period of 1919, when industries were really kind of scaling back all of that wartime upscaling that they had been doing. So there's a conversation over, you know, who's going to have that job when the war ends? What is America going to look like post World War I? Who deserves to live and work where they choose? Those kinds of things.
Now, what collections in the Hagley Library did you access to help you uncover this story?
Yeah, so mainly I looked at the Penn Virginia Corporation records, which, as you might expect, have a lot of connections between Pennsylvania and Virginia. It started, I believe it was incorporated in the 1880s as the Virginia Coal and Iron Company. And it ended up being, the records themselves end up holding a lot of different companies that were started by these Pennsylvania families that ended up intermarrying and being interrelated. And within that collection, I found the records of a corporation called the Wentz Corporation, which was a Philadelphia-based corporation of one of these families that basically served as a land holding company for the family. The Wentz family was very much involved in southwestern Virginia in a place called Stonega. They had a company town there, as well as other company towns. They had the Stonega Coke and Coal Company. But as they were involved down there, they started buying up coal lands just across the border in eastern Kentucky. So these Wentz Corporation records show how this land transfers hands over many years. Oftentimes, lawyers are very involved in this. How do we? They're really haggling with these people to get them to sell them the land so that they can have an entire tract of, I think it ends up being 14,000 acres in Harlan County that they know is good quality coal land, and they hold it, and they eventually sell it in 1917 to U.S. Steel for a few $1 million. I think it was maybe $1.5 million at the time, which is of course much different now. But I remember looking in the sources and seeing conversations back and forth between a figure, Daniel Wentz, who was based in Philadelphia, and his lawyers on the ground talking about this purchase process. And one of the lawyers talks about sitting in on the meeting that actually, where they drew up the contract and signed the check. And he said it was the biggest check he had ever seen for that sort of transfer of land. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But that was basically the collection I looked at, the Wentz Corporation and other businesses that were connected. Again, sort of get a look at how they were managing their coal company was insightful, because some of those records were sort of hard to find. Like U.S. Steel is kind of famously, tight-lipped, or they don't let many people into their archives to look at their records. So just to get a look at what a coal company did to recruit workers and manage them was good too. And then at the end, I ended up looking at some of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which that was just my last week there, but that collection is huge and very interesting.
And how are you able to use these materials to advance your project?
Yeah, so they helped me, I think, put it in sort of a larger national context. I think I described my project as a social history, but I think what pairs well with that, just to make these connections, is sort of a business and economic element to it. So to look at why U.S. Steel wanted these coal lands and how that process happens, and just to kind of make that connection of it's all tied to World War I. It happens at this specific time for a very specific reason, and people are all tied up in that. I mean, people are very much connected to the resources that they extract and the resources that the coal companies want and U.S. Steel wants. So I think it helps to tell a more complete story. It helps to sort of round out that context of why it happened where it did.
Do you have any particularly exciting document that you uncovered in the archives that was perhaps a smoking gun or something that really stuck in your mind?
Yeah, there were a lot. The one that I mentioned was kind of interesting, just talking about he had never seen so much money. Others from the Wentz Corporation, when they're buying up a lot of this coal land, it ends up being owned by a lot of like New York tycoon types. And one of the families that owned a certain parcel of land that they were trying to get so they could square off their title was actually related to Citizen Genet from an older period of American history. And this man passed away right after they got his land title. And in a letter, one of the lawyers remarks to, again, Daniel Wentz, like, I had no idea we were dealing with such a blue blood, And so just that was kind of interesting. And then there was one in the Pennsylvania Railroad collection where it was a letter from an African-American veteran who had served in World War I and had come back, and his job had been claimed by someone else. And he essentially wrote a letter to the Pennsylvania Railroad saying, I served my time in the war, I served this country, and I deserve my job back. I've done my part. Why can't you fulfill your side of the agreement? Which I thought was very interesting, because you often hear those sort of broad political statements like, we return fighting, which was something that W.E.B. Du Bois said in the crisis. But to see, a railroad worker that had actually served in France come home and experience that and wrote the letter, and actually to see him write that out was pretty cool. But tons of great stuff. I mean, I know I'm forgetting some others too. So,
what were some of the implications for the trajectory of these two towns, Corbin and Lynch, having all diverged and reacted differently to the Great Migration?
Yeah, well, they have very different historical legacies. Really, for the rest of the 20th century, Corbin becomes known throughout the South, but also other parts of the country, as a place where Black people are not welcome. The word spreads through just family networks, but also people traveling that don't stop for gas in Corbin, Kentucky. Keep it moving. It's one of these places where you're not welcome.
Would that be noted in the Green Book, perhaps?
It's very much that same idea, but the sources for the Green Book that I've looked at do not detail anything about Corbin. I'll get into that a little bit more, but what I've seen does not mention that. But on the other hand, Lynch becomes a place of really almost of like ancestral heritage for a lot of African American families. They, of course, in the 60s, when U.S. Steel starts to kind of cut back on their domestic production, Lynch becomes essentially a shell of its former self. And so Eastern Kentucky is just sort of one stop along the Great Migration, where some of these families end up moving to places like Cleveland or Chicago, Detroit. Some move back down south. I mean, it's just, again, one stop along the Great Migration. But every Memorial Day weekend, African-American families with roots in Lynch return home for a reunion, I should say, every Memorial Day weekend. And so that idea is really interesting to me, that just down the road, you have a place that is a sundown town where that kind of thing doesn't exist. And oftentimes to get to Lynch, you have to pass through Corbin, just because of how Corbin is on the interstate, and it kind of it mirrors that gateway into and out of the coal fields that existed on the railroad. So very different historical legacies even to this day.
And I wonder whether there are perhaps broader implications for the national scene based on your findings.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, again, it can kind of help us understand why these things happen. It's not inevitable. There are certain things that can make people more amenable to living with people of a different race or ethnicity. And so it's important to kind of understand what creates sort of the powder keg that could easily result in racial violence. And then I think too, trying to understand that whole World War I period, especially 1919 Red Summer. I think back on the summer of 2020, which looked a lot different as far as the nature of the violence and sort of all the details of it. But a lot of people compared it, sort of the basic comparison was 1968, a lot of comparisons there, but also that whole Red Summer wave of violence where it just seemed like things were happening one after another. I mean, it was almost like, what's going to happen next, So I think trying to understand that period and putting it in context with all of the other racial and class episodes of violence that are happening in that period is important. And then also, I think it's a lesson in how history can reveal things that we didn't know about the past, or maybe we were misguided about. I mean, there's lots of myths that spring up around this incident in Corbin about why it happened. There's rumors at the time that there was actually a rape that occurred that resulted in a lynching, but that's not the case. And we know this because there was an investigation where testimonies were taken. And so being able to take sort of the myth about something that happened and all of the sort of misguided notions about the past, and be able to pair that with solid research and say, no, this is what actually happened, and sort of provide that window into it, I think is a useful thing to do. And it can provide, I think, people a way forward to get past some of the lies and myths about it, and actually examine the truth.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. What a great project.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, I really enjoyed my time at the Hagley, and enjoyed chatting with you today.
Well, that's great. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online at hagley.org. That's hagley.org. Don't be a stranger.